Hello, everybody. It's great to talk to you. I'm George Gibson. I'm the executive editor at Grove Atlantic. With great pleasure, we'll be talking to you today about a book called Wild Minds, The Artists and Rivalries That Inspired the Golden Age of Animation by Reid Mitenbuler. Like many of you, I imagine, I grew up watching cartoons on Saturday mornings. Popeye, Bugs Bunny, all of the classics. And I did not realize that when I was watching them, they actually were sanitized versions of the originals. That's just one of the fascinating facts that I discovered as I worked with Reid Mitenbuler on his book, Wild Minds. And I want to turn it over to Reid now to give you a brief introduction to the book, and then we've got several questions and discussion points that we'll be talking about. So Reid, over to you, and for 3 or 4 minutes on talking about how you came to write this book, what excites you about it, etc.
Thanks, George, and thanks everyone for having us all on. So old cartoons are something that as a kid I watched, I think the same as any kid, just Saturday mornings after school, a lot of its old repeats. It wasn't something I was particularly obsessive about. You know, when I became a teenager, I moved on to other things, you know, movies and music and other interests. And it wasn't until I was in college, I remember just catching an old Looney Tune, and I remember an Al Smith joke, an old New York politician. And I remember thinking, like, that's an interesting joke to drop into something that's meant for kids. You know, I always kind of thought cartoons were meant for kids because as a kid myself, I mean, it seemed like they were aimed at us. All the advertising was aimed at us. Saturday morning thing, it was aimed at us. And I found myself laughing far harder as an adult at old Looney Tunes than I ever had as a kid. And I came to realize they weren't really meant for kids. I mean, there was very sophisticated humor. A lot of those parts had kind of gone over my head when I was younger. And there were a few points over the next few years along the way where I was sort of reminded of this. I was reading A Cultural History by John Leland about the American concept of hipness, being cool, the psychology behind that. A big part of that is this idea of rebellion or pushing against the mainstream or pushing against what's square. And he uses examples from popular culture, you know, getting into Marlon Brando and The Wild One, or James Dean, Jimi Hendrix lighting his guitar on fire. But he also uses a lot of cartoon examples. He uses Felix the cat as his jazz age icon. And when I went back to look at the first Felix, I was really surprised. He actually commits suicide in it. Not as something to celebrate or anything, but it's very kind of surreal, kind of dark cartoon. And that really surprised me. And he uses the Fleischers as another example. They used a lot of jazz. They collaborated with Cab Calloway a lot, but they're doing this in the late 20s and the 30s when jazz was kind of like hip hop was in the 80s. It was subversive. It was kind of dangerous. And the Fleischers were Jewish immigrants, and they used their cartoons to provide a lot of commentary on, hold on, my vent here, just provide a lot of commentary on the Jewish immigrant experience and, you know, to satirize society. So I wanted to learn more, and I couldn't really find a book about this topic. There were several that were academic or, you know, a little more focused on one very particular aspect of cartoons, but there wasn't really a broad, more general history for audiences. I could see people reading on a beach or on an airplane. And so that's kind of when the idea really took form. And then as I did the research, you can see that cartoons over that first 50 years of animation, from around 1910 to around 1960, they really reflect the times of the nation, culturally, politically, economically. And they found that the story that I built around all these different characters in charge of working at all these rival cartoon studios also had their own influence. You can see the propaganda cartoons of World War II. And they were much more part of the public consciousness and pop culture in that first 50 years in America than I think they are today. And so you can kind of see all the ways they worked their ways down these alleys, just touching on all kinds of aspects of American culture that I thought were really surprising, kind of contrarian, that I never really expected. So that's how the book came about.
So the animation and film industries had overlapped a lot. And perhaps you could describe a little bit the connections between animation and film, starting in the 1910s and where Hollywood really began, which wasn't in Hollywood.
Right. Right. And so that's one of my favorite stories in the book is, the very beginning of the movie industry, it wasn't in California, it was in Fort Lee, New Jersey, and in parts of the Bronx and in Queens. That's where all the big studios started. And then they quickly made their way to Hollywood, and they realized that California had better light for filming, cheaper taxes. It helped them bust up the unions and things that they're having problems with on the East Coast. So the animation portion of the film industry started in New York as well, because it drew a lot of its talent from newspapers, the old newspaper cartooning tradition, political cartoons, and that sort of thing, those kinds of artists. And when the studios moved west to California, the animation studios pretty much stayed in New York. Just, it was natural for them, it was a little more easy for them to work there, to get their talent from there. So the animation portion of the film industry was a little more attached to the newspaper business, the magazine business, that kind of community. And you see it then start to shift to the West Coast in the 1920s with Walt Disney. Walt Disney had a choice when he was a young man. He was from Kansas City. He's like, well, am I going to go east, where the animation industry is actually centered in New York, or do I go west? And he chose to go west because his brother Roy was in California recovering from tuberculosis. And this is when we see the first really great rivalry form. We've got this East Coast versus West Coast. A lot of the East Coast animators, led by the Fleischers, who are responsible for Popeye and Betty Boop. It's New York, a lot of immigrants. It was very urban. The themes of the cartoons are very urban, body, very violent. It was very surreal. And then in the West, you've got Disney, who is from the Midwest, and the themes are a little more rural. You see more animals. They're just as violent. That's something I made sure to point out in the book, that Disney, we have that term Disneyfied today. It kind of refers to something that's maybe a little diluted or watered down or more kid friendly, but not in the first 20 years of Walt Disney's career. His cartoons were often very, they pushed the edge, going up to the edge a lot, just as much as East Coast, just in a different way. He used less jazz and that sort of thing. We see this idea form from these two different sides. What is America? How are we going to portray ourselves? And that's the first rivalry we see with these different studios.
And the cartoons originally were intended, were they not, as shorts before movies? So they were intended for an adult audience, but as shorts, previewing or preceding movies in theaters.
Right, kind of as an hors d'oeuvre before the main show. So people are seeing them in theaters, dark theaters at night, usually adults, where they paid a ticket price, and that's what supported them, as opposed to later, after the 50s, where you're seeing them on television, where they're financially supported by advertising, and corporate advertisers kind of become involved, and they start kind of dictating what can be shown. And then that's when you see the sea change in the content and the style of cartoons.
So what made the golden age of animation golden? Maybe just frame the book, the period of time that you're talking about in the book, and what made that particular era golden?
In the book, primarily 1910 to 1960. And I think whenever we talk about golden ages, it's important to remember they're not always golden for everyone. There's a bit of nostalgia baked into that term. But with this, the golden age of animation tracks with the golden age of Hollywood in the 30s and 40s. And for me, a lot of, the reason I call it a golden age is because this is the moment when everyone's coming up with the rules for both of these art forms, especially in film. People are developing the language of film. How do we tell stories? What are the formulas? What are the formats? What are the tricks of the trade? They're doing the same thing in animation. You've got Charlie Chaplin coming up with this new language of comedy on film. And a lot of the early animators were friends with Chaplin. Chuck Jones, as a kid, grew up in LA, remembers watching Chaplin. He'd go down to the lot and they'd be filming outside, and he'd watch Chaplin for hours. Chaplin was very gracious, and he'd come over and he'd talk to these kids. And he remembers taking all these lessons from Chaplin and Keaton as well, Buster Keaton, watching him film the same scenes 50 times. And he realized this is a very precise art form. There's a science to it as well as an art, and taking those kinds of lessons. And, you're not seeing the material back then. It was a little more fly by the seat of the pants. It's not being market tested. Algorithms aren't determining what people are going to make. They're not necessarily as wrapped up in Twitter outrage battles or things like that. It's just a lot of experimentation, a lot of just throwing it against the wall to see what sticks. And it's interesting to see that, especially with the Looney Tunes, as they're working out, the pacing and the beats and these formulas, how influential they are. I see Steven Spielberg, Dave Chappelle today saying things about how influential they found some of these old cartoons to their own work. I love to see in the show Baskets. If anyone watches Baskets with Zach Galifianakis, you'll miss it if you blink. But there's a scene where he actually has Coco the Clown, a silent cartoon character from the 20s that the Fleischers created, dancing in the background on a television screen as he's playing a clown in the show. So for me, that's why I think this is a golden age time. Some of the best cartoons were made back then, and especially the Looney Tunes. I have a soft spot in my heart for those. But really, it's when they were created and everything was getting figured out, and it was experimental, and it was a lot of fun.
So there are a great many origin stories in the book. I think that's one of the great aspects of this book, that these are the origin stories of not only the great animators, Disney, Fleischer, all of those guys, Chuck Jones, stories of Mel Blanc, the great voice of so many different characters. Okay, but also the stories, the origin stories of cartoons, from Mickey Mouse and to Popeye. Great stories about Popeye and the origins of spinach, or the power of the spinach in his pipe, which I'll leave for you to find out in the book. But Reid, can you tell the story of one origin story? And I think you wanted to talk about Mr. Magoo, which is a great story. But tell the story of that, if you will. And then we'll turn it over to Amy and Malcolm.
Right. So the Mr. Magoo story, it's very California specific, which I think this audience will really like. So Magoo was created by UPA, which was a cartoon studio that started in the 40s. It started kind of as the anti-Disney studio. UPA stands for United Productions of America. A lot of the founders of this cartoon studio had formerly worked at Disney, but a lot of them had been very young. They were the younger generation at Disney. The older generation, which had pretty much come out of that old newspaper cartooning tradition, so that world of kind of old newspaper hacks, very kind of grizzled, maybe a little blue collar. The new generation at Disney, the younger people working on films like Snow White, had gone to art school primarily, with a little more intellectual, if you want to use that term for it, about how they approached the art, a little more theoretical. Politically, they were very different than Disney, who had started to become very anti-union. And they had fought against that. They fought against Disney Union. So they created their own studio, UPA, which was ran very differently than this Disney studio, a little more communal, things like that. And some of their first jobs where they did campaign cartoons for FDR, with Hellbent for Election. They did a project for the United Auto Workers of America called Brotherhood of Man. There are incidents of racial strife in the factories between Black and white workers. So the UPA guys were brought in to make a cartoon to kind of try to calm that sort of strife. So these are their projects. They did a lot of commercial work, a lot of training videos, and a lot of their artistic work was very abstract. It was experimental. They worked with Theodore Geisel, Dr. Seuss, on some projects. It was kind of his more out of the box kind of ideas. They worked with novelists like Juliette Lowell, a lot of work with James Thurber from The New Yorker. Some of them had done cartoons for James Thurber. And they were doing these kind of cartoons, but they realized they needed a character kind of like the Fleischers had with Betty Boop or with Popeye, or that Walt Disney had with Mickey Mouse, that one strong character. And they had teamed up with Columbia. And Columbia gave them the go-ahead. You can go ahead and use humans, but we want animals to be the primary focus, because animals are a little more, they're cuter, and cuteness is profitable. And so one of the creators, John Hundley, who's one of the founders of UPA, and who actually, if anyone listens to the band Yo La Tengo, he's the father of Georgia Hubley, the guitarist for that band. But John Hubley, sets to the task, and he teams up with this writer, Millard Kaufman. And Millard Kaufman is one of these writers who just brimming with life experience. He had studied English at Johns Hopkins, and then he became a reporter for the New York Daily News in the 30s and 40s, covering the grimy streets of New York in those decades. Then he goes off and he's in the Marines during World War II. He catches malaria, dengue fever. He won the Bronze Star. He was at Iwo Jima, Guadalcanal, Okinawa. When he comes back, he signs up for this experiment where he's got to drink cobra venom, which is actually how I met his wife. I guess she was a nurse on the experiment. So he's just this really interesting guy. John Hundley and Millard Kaufman, they pair off and they go to a cabin in California just to talk about this new character. And they're drinking and they're talking. And in their conversation, both discover that they have rich uncles who are these kind of irascible millionaire types, kind of these country club Republican types, who are very stodgy, very opinionated. They shout down other people with their opinions. And then the conversation drifts to the Red Scare and blacklisting. Millard Kaufman actually later would lend his name to Dalton Trumbo for the script of Gun Crazy. And then they start talking about weird California place names like Rancho Cucamonga or Tarzana or Rough and Ready. And they decide that that's who this new character, Mr. Magoo, is gonna be. His character comes from the name Point Magoo in California. And they want him, they make him nearsighted. You can't really see, so you can't see what's right in front of his face. You can't see the reality in front of his face. He's kind of mean, and he makes these grand misjudgments based on poor information. He mistakes a walrus for his tennis partner or a severed head for an old college chum. And the whole idea driving him was supposed to reflect the buffoonery that they saw at the time of the House Un-American Activities Committee. And so it's this really interesting political statement driving the character. And they got Jim Backus to voice him, who was later the voice of Thurston Howell III in Gilligan's Island. He was also in Rebel Without a Cause. Apparently James Dean was obsessed with Mr. Magoo, and on the set of Rebel Without the Cause, Jim Backus would coach James Dean on it, and James Dean wanted to channel the spirit of Mr. Magoo in some of his lines in Rebel, such as the dead puppies line, that sort of thing. But I think it's a great story, and it kind of illustrates, it's a good example from the book, just how these cartoons found their way into other corners of American culture and pop culture, and where the inspiration for them came from. In this case, it's a really interesting political and creative story.
That's great, Reid. Thank you so much. Amy, we'll turn it over to you, but I just want to say, if any of you want to get a copy of either Wild Minds or Cloudmaker, you can, I think, and you're going to provide some emails that people can send to us, and we'd be happy to send out, a PDF or a finished copy of the book or an ARC to any of you who want one. And I can also send along a bunch of links to cartoons if anyone wants to see some fascinating old cartoons. I've got a bunch of links to them. So, Amy, over to you and Malcolm.
Hi, everybody. George and I were talking yesterday about how these two books do and don't relate. And the kind of common thread that we came up with was the 1930s. Cloudmaker is set in the 30s. And obviously that was an important period in the golden age. And also the idea of inventiveness, which Malcolm and I are going to get into a little bit later. Cloudmaker is a book that's set in the early 30s in the breadbasket region of Montana, and it's about a group of young people who set out to build their own airplane. And in 2015 or so, which was the year after we bought the book, I was in Bozeman, Montana, visiting family and also visiting Jim Harrison. And I went to the Museum of the Rockies on an afternoon off and saw one of these airplanes. So we're going to talk a little bit about that. But if you have time while we're here, I would just encourage you to Google the word Pietenpol and then airplane. Pietenpol is P-I-E-T-E-N-P-O-L. And you'll see that people are still doing this. These were airplanes that could be built with a converted car engine. And that is sort of, it's like a slightly wacky subculture. And this little airplane image on the book is an image of one of the planes. And so you remember Malcolm from Painted Horses, which we published in 2014. We were very, very excited to have the strong love and support of the indie community, and for it to be made a #1 indie next pick. It became a national bestseller. Barnes & Noble followed your lead and made a Discover pick as well. And so I'd like to ask Malcolm to talk a little bit about the Pietenpol plane and how he started thinking about what the ideas that became this book.
Okay. I actually the airplane that Amy referred to that's in the Museum of the Rockies in Bozeman, Montana, was my first introduction to this whole phenomenon and subculture as well. So that particular airplane is what sort of launched the whole concept. And I think it was probably 2008 or 2009 that I first saw it, went to the museum. It's about 3 hours from where I live in Missoula. And we actually went over there because there was a touring exhibit of King Tut artifacts. And my one son at the time was really, really into that. And I'm glad I took him to this exhibit in order to discover this whole other thing, which would become this novel. I just sort of sat on the idea for several years while Painted Horses played itself out. And then when it came time to start another book, that was what I went to. The plane itself, to take a look at it, it hangs from the ceiling in the museum, and it is clearly not any kind of a professional job. It looks like it was cobbed together out of farm implements and whatnot. And I just was like, well, it looks like a working airplane, but it was pretty obviously built in a barn somewhere. So I started to research who did it, when they built it, why they built it, and then just landed on this whole sort of forgotten era of the golden age of aviation, in which there was a lot of sort of homegrown shop type experimentation going on. We're all familiar with Amelia Earhart and Lindbergh and the sort of more professional end of flight then. But when Lindbergh flew across the ocean in 1927, it wound up igniting this massive sort of almost cultural phenomenon of flight enthusiasts and kids who were really interested in the idea of flight and figuring out how they could be a part of this. And so there were like modern mechanic stories devoted to how to build your own airplane, and just this constant experimentation going on. And what Pete and Paul, the man who came up with this particular set of plans for a plane, really landed on was how to convert a Ford automobile engine into an airworthy motor, because no one believed that could be done. They felt that the power plant for an airplane had to be specific to the conditions required to keep a craft in the air. And they didn't think it would be possible to convert an auto engine to this task. But he did it, and it created this avenue for kids in rural places, like the ones who built this airplane in the museum, to pursue this dream.
And did you model your young aviators on any particular person or people?
I did. When I started to do the research for the book, and also specifically to the plane that's on display, as it turned out, the museum had this huge archive about this other kid who had been the test pilot for the Museum of the Rockies plane, but he had built his own airplane about 30 miles away from the origination point of the one that's on display there. And his name was David Comstock, and he wound up becoming an aeronautics engineer as an adult. But he built and flew his own airplane in his father's blacksmith shop when he was 17 years old. And then he's the one who really became the character inspiration for Huck, my character in Cloudmaker, because his personal history and story is just so fascinating, and there was so much there to work with. And he's so totally typified the sort of can-do spirit of a young person in that era.
So speaking of Huck, yeah. There's some great names in this book. We were talking last night, obviously Huck as a nod to Mark Twain, and we were talking last night about how Annalise, who's Huck's cousin, who comes to visit for the summer and ends up kind of witnessing and participating in this building of this airplane. Her name is Clutterbuck, which is Beryl Markham's maiden name.
Correct.
I love the way the spirit of Twain kind of hovers over this book. And I'm curious what your favorite Twain is, and what you kind of heard in your head while you were writing.
Yeah, well, I mentioned earlier, I think before we actually started to record, but I'm from Northern California myself. I'm from Placerville, California. And there's the Gold Rush era has a Mark Twain dimension to it. Just like the Calaveras County and Angels Camp, and they have the whole celebrated jumping frog of Calaveras County, and they still sort of use that in Angels Camp, California, as kind of it's sort of a annual regional festival that's about the fact that Twain had been there. So even independent of the more obvious sort of Mississippi River stuff and Missouri stuff that Twain's noted for, he was a figure in the Gold Rush West too. So when you and I were talking, previously, you asked me what my favorite Twain book was or work was, and I just jumped right to Huckleberry Finn because it's the obvious choice. But when I had more time to think about it, kind of a forgotten classic is Roughing It, and it's just this hilarious series of sketches about what it's like to be on the frontier, and I'm sure all of that sort of played into my sensibility when I was putting this together. But I don't remember at what point it occurred to me to use Twain and those sort of boys' adventure novels as a touchstone or as a thing to work with for this book. But it did occur to me fairly early on that, given that they were young people who were building these planes back in the 30s, it'd be really kind of a natural envelope for this to take a Twain style boys adventure story and just move it forward from the antebellum South to the golden age of aviation and sort of use that as a model. So I tried to keep that in my head the whole time, and Huck's name obviously is a reference to that.
Mm-hmm. There's also a little bit of Southern California in the book. The cousin Annalise, who I mentioned earlier, is from LA. Right. And she's had flying lessons. So when she arrives, Huck is initially very suspicious of her, but quickly realizes that she's a sister in arms for this project. And her mother and Huck's mother, who is her aunt, are both very much devoted to Aimee Semple McPherson.
Right.
And so I wonder if you could talk a little bit about her and about the marriage between religion and pop culture.
Yeah, in a way, it's not unrelated to what Reid was talking about, earlier, with Southern California being this kind of like throw it against the wall and see what sticks in terms of theatricality and showbiz and mass media. What was possible with mass media in its golden age or early days, and Aimee Semple McPherson was probably the original sort of televangelist, even though it wasn't tele, it was radio for the most part. But she was this sort of Pentecostal, very dynamic woman who had spent a number of years on what they called the Sawdust Trail, going to sort of tent revivals and things, and became known as a faith healer. Ended up in Southern California and saw the potential for radio, evangelizing through radio, and just married sort of theatrics and drama and histrionics even with religion and mass media. So and I don't even remember how I heard about Aimee Semple McPherson to begin with. I sort of have known about her my whole life. I grew up in a religious background, not Pentecostal, which is speaking in tongues and the more obvious sort of faith healing and things like that. Background I grew up in wasn't quite that dramatic, but yeah, I wanted to explore the for me, very personal idea of what it's like to grow up in a subculture like that, and then sort of have your horizons expand a little bit and have to weigh what your burgeoning sensibilities are with your background and your community.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, she and the other figure that kind of hovers over the book is Amelia Earhart, because it takes place during her last voyage, what ends up being her last voyage. And I think of the two of them as both being, you know, geniuses with the media.
Oh yeah, definitely.
Really understanding the media in a very intuitive way.
Right.
And the Huck's mother is a survivor of the 1918 flu pandemic, obviously before he's born.
Yeah.
And I'm curious what you think of as the sort of the moment that this book is set, and how a pandemic and a depression kind of influence what these characters see as possible or safe, or what they cling to.
Yeah. I mean, that's a good question and a pretty deep one. I mean, if we can just kind of touch on the fact that the 1918 Spanish flu is even in the book, because that sort of bowled me over, that I had decided to incorporate that into the story, only to have, you know, the present zeitgeist be what it is, present circumstances be what they are. But David Comstock, the kid I mentioned earlier, who was the model for Huck, his mother had died in the 1918 pandemic when he was 4 years old. So David was raised by his father only. His father was a machinist and blacksmith, no other siblings. He was an only child. And his dad apparently just sort of gave him a free hand to do what he wanted. And the result was this kid who built an airplane and flew it around, flew to the state school in Bozeman eventually to matriculate when he was 18 years old in the engineering department, which is a whole other kind of crazy story. But yeah, to get back to the question, I mean, I think that there were so many things going on in the 30s and so many contradictory messaging and contradictory personalities who were equally famous. People like, you know, if you take the Amelia Earhart versus Amy Semple McPherson, I mean, you're looking at two fairly extreme personalities who sort of come together in a Venn diagram in the middle. They both did manipulate media. They both stood for very different things. Amy Semple McPherson, despite the fact that she was a female televangelist, was extremely traditional in her notions of women's roles and just the proper social order and whatnot. Whereas Amelia Earhart was an early Equal Rights Amendment supporter and was very actively involved in promoting aviation for girls specifically. So I just tried to reanimate that era through the experiences of these characters. And again, you know, another counterpoint is one young boy character and one teenage girl character, and how do their sensibilities and their experiences both differ, and how are they similar? How can they ally? So, yeah.
And that's something I think you bring into your fiction a lot, is just sort of, you know, you write fiction that's set in the past, but your women are very modern.
Yeah.
Very much kind of butting against what people want them to be in the time that they're living.
Yeah, and in a way, Annalise was, you know, a different character to write than Catherine in Painted Horses, because Catherine is a product of the 50s and Annalise is a product of the 30s and even the late 20s. And, you know, there was a sort of, it seems like a ratcheting back in terms of what women were able to sort of strive for and get away with, you know, ironically in an earlier time versus, you know, the far more conformist and conservative 1950s.
Yeah. Well, and I appreciate it also that you brought in the relationship between Annalise and her aunt, who is a very, very conservative and tradition bound and religious observant woman, but you see through her discussing and opening up about her past, you see what was possible for women of earlier decades as well.
Right, right.
Even though she doesn't make those choices herself.
Right, yeah.
And I guess I'd like to close, and then we can head towards the Q&A with just talk about the airplane and what an airplane and this sort of idea of tinkering and what airplanes represent, and
yeah,
why that caught your imagination the way it did.
Well, just seeing the Peyton pole that they have in the museum was so eye-opening to me, because I had never, I mean, I knew a bit about the early age of flight. I mean, I was, interested in the Wrights and, just interested in history in general. And I knew, I mean, Lindbergh was probably the most famous man on the planet after he made that 1927 transatlantic crossing. And I knew about the lore of that just as a function of being interested in history and popular culture and whatnot. But I had never heard that there were people who were actively building airplanes in their own barns and shops and then flying them around, in this, relatively unregulated era in which, there was nothing like the contemporary version of, FAA regulations or anything like that. And so it just, it made me start to think really hard about the newness of aviation and the newness of flight in that era. And, from the Wrights, somehow managing to build and power with a gasoline engine a heavier than air ship and have it work. And they achieved this in like a 5 or 7 year period. And it's just remarkable. And then from that, the next great moment would be the Lindbergh flight. And when you really look at how utterly daring the whole thing was, and what just an insane achievement it was to be, about 17 years or so after the Wrights had really perfected, flight using a motor. And you just think, wow, I mean, the technology was screaming fast in a relative way. And then I guess it just, once I thought about it, it really didn't surprise me that there were people who were also trying to, do something similar on their own in their own garage. So.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I think it allows the kids in the book, it's also a door out from the circumstances that they find themselves in.
Yeah, I guess in a larger sort of thematic way, I realized that historical phenomenon would be a great vehicle to just explore kids who are trying to escape from their own circumstances, because they're building their own sort of transcendental vehicle to exit where they are. It's like one thing that Jim Harrison, said at one point. I mean, the best place to start a story a lot of times is with a journey, because most everybody's sick of where they are. And, if you can grab a hold of them and take them on a tour somewhere, you're sort of doing them a service,
Mm-hmm. Good. Well, I just want to say thank you for everyone who's here, because we know this has been a rough season for everyone, especially independent booksellers. And it means a lot for you to spend your time with us. This is Malcolm's book, which we have in galleys, and my email is in the chat, and I'll turn it over to Anne.
Yeah, we do have a question here in the chat from Louisa. Have you ever ridden in one of these planes?
No, not a Peyton pole. I haven't. There are a lot of them in the Midwest, and bizarrely, there are a ton of them in the UK and Australia too. And there are these clubs, and there are people who are still actively building them. But the only two that I am aware of in Montana are the two that are in one's in the museum and one's in the Historical Society Museum. So yeah, I'd love to ride in one, but.
Yeah, we had some people email some questions through too. So there's a lot of fascinating airplane stories you must have run across in doing this. Is there any one or two or several that you were hoping to include in the book but just couldn't? Any?
Well, I tried to use the most striking ones that came out of David Comstock's personal sort of experiences. I guess that one of the most remarkable things about him in particular is he went to Bozeman for a year as a engineering student and came back to his father's blacksmith shop in Roundup, Montana, which is probably about, by car back then, it would have been a 4 or 5 hour drive probably. But he actually supercharged his Pete and Pole airplane using a discarded Hoover vacuum cleaner. And this would have been in like 1935 or 36. And once he'd achieved that, he was able to fly it to this insane elevation. So it was just sort of, I guess it's not a direct answer to the question. I'm not off the top of my head coming up with like exciting airplane stories that I wanted to incorporate, but didn't. I mean, most everything that really blew me away went into the book.
That's cool. That's good. And Louisa had another question. Why do you think the Midwest is so drawn to planes from this era?
Ooh. Well, Pete and Pole was from the Midwest. He was from Minnesota. And there was a magazine back then that was similar to what still exists as Popular Mechanics now. It was called Modern Mechanics. And they were heavily invested in flight stuff, flight experimentation. They would offer prizes for people to come up with various, airplane improvements and whatnot. And Pete and Pole was a farmer and a machinist. And he had been his whole thing was to try to come up with a auto engine conversion that would fly an airplane. And he achieved it. And there was an article and started flying the thing around. And this is in around 1930 or 32. And there was an article in Modern Mechanics flatly stating that it was absolutely impossible to convert an automobile engine for use in a plane. And he wrote back and he said, actually, it is not impossible. I've done it and I've got X number of hours flying it. And I think Modern Mechanics was published in Minneapolis. So it would have been like a couple hour trek from where Pete and Pole was doing this. And they said, well, if that's true, can you fly it here and let us look at it? And so he did. He flies it, and the editors and their engineers and whatnot look at this thing. And then it was the start of this whole other phenomenon, which is sort of still with us in some limited subcultural fashion.
That's incredible.
Yeah.
Some questions are here for Reid too. Something from my email. Somebody wants to hear a little bit more about rivalries, how the rivalries might have influenced the trajectory of the cartooning then. And there's another one about, you always hear about these secret messages kind of hidden in Disney cartoons and everything. Do you touch on that at all in your book? And is that really a true thing, or did somebody make that up?
Right. So as far as the hidden messages, there are some, not necessarily subliminal, like, go out and kill people or anything, particularly nefarious like that, but especially in the Fleischer cartoons, there were a lot of New York and Jewish in-jokes. Like in the background, you'll have a character go in and order food, but then be served a ham, which isn't kosher. And then there'll be like little jokes in the background with thermometers and things like that. So the Fleischers were big fans of putting in those kinds of things. Popeye, there was a slang term, a lot of people called spinach or marijuana spinach back then. Birdseed, the name of Popeye's dog, was another popular term for it. And you would see after a while, it wasn't necessarily like spinach was supposed to be, kind of a proxy for marijuana. But you see that sort of being willed into reality after the fact, where in way later versions, he's eating things like pure Bolivian spinach, and the fact that he took his spinach through his pipe sometimes, where all these kind of very subtle references to subversive kinds of things like drugs and whatever. So there are a lot of hidden themes. The way the Fleischers would use music, they've got, parts of some of their cartoons where they would use old Americana versus these kind of clarinet sort of Eastern European songs to kind of show tension, in America as they're adapting to this nation. So there's a lot of that in a lot of these cartoons. What was the first question?
The rivalries.
So there are a lot of these push-pull rivalries. So the very, kind of the patron saint of animation is a man named Winsor McCay, who's a fabulously successful newspaper cartoonist. And his idea at the very beginning, when he's making some of the very first cartoons, is that they would actually become a replacement for art. He had this idea that you'd go into a museum and you would no longer see paintings that were static, you would actually see moving pictures. And so he was very high-minded about what this could become. And there was a Frenchman, Emile Cole, who was a bit of a rival to him. I think Emile Cole saw it as a rivalry. Winsor McCay really didn't see it as a rivalry at all. And Emile Cole had come out of the art world in Paris. He was part of a group called the Incoherents, which was a kind of a precursor to Dadaism. And they had these competing visions of what art would be, surreal and fantastic and that sort of thing. You had a lot of then competing visions as Disney kind of starts taking over in the 20s, and Warner Brothers, when Warner Brothers started its rise, so Bugs Bunny, Daffy Duck, Porky Pig, and these kinds of cartoons, a lot of the Warner Brothers animators who had once worked for Disney, because there's a lot of poaching that went on between these different studios, they saw themselves as an antidote to the creeping sentimentality of a lot of Disney cartoons. And they would have, I quote from the book, so there's some purple language here, I guess, but he was like, look, we wanted to show Disney that cartoons don't have to look like a fucking kid's book. Like that's one of the quotes, like that kind of thing. And they saw their art, as being guided by a more chaotic energy. And it was, a different style. And then the UPA story, when I was talking before about Mr. Magoo, that was very much, there were a lot of political comments that the UPA artists wanted to make with their cartoons. They were heavily influenced by these Eastern European artists, a lot of people coming out of the Bauhaus movement and that sort of thing. You see a lot of them, they issued these treatises on, form and function and aesthetics. And so they were using their art. And then you would see Disney come back at them with cartoons like Toot, Whistle, Pumpkin Bloom. It's about like I always forget the exact title. It's a very long title. It was a musical cartoon. And he was using their aesthetic to show them, hey, I can do this too. And I'm still on top. I'm still the king, like that sort of thing. So a lot of them, they set different visions for what they thought the art should be, and they would compete with each other on the screen about that.
That's fun.
And I feel like there was a third question in there that
No, I think that was it. But Louisa has a question here too. Why do these classic cartoons hold up so well for kids today when other old, not so old TV shows do not?
Yeah, I think a big part of that gets to the fact, so let's use Chuck Jones as an example. He's a kid in the teens. I think he was born in 1907. And he's going to the studio a lot. And he's watching Charlie Chaplin, and he's just absorbing the lessons from this master. As I said, watching him do the same scene 50 times over. And you go to the Disney studio, and Disney sunk a ton of money into creating a school. It was ran by a man named Don Graham. And they would go out and they would just film nature, or they would bring in animal experts and they would dissect animals in front of the animators so they could learn animal anatomy. They had experts in color theory came in, and they had a lot of artists like Salvador Dali. They had Thomas Hart Benton was always hanging around the studio giving lectures to the artists. And they looked at it, they were really studied. They saw it as a real craft. And they broke it down into this art form where Jones especially was like, this is something that we really need to be precise about. If you look at an old Looney Tunes cartoon, they hit all these very precise beats. And it was a science to these people. And I think that's part of the reason they hold up so well is like they were very careful about what they were doing, and they were trying to create very universal messages. You were talking about Mark Twain before, when we were talking about the Cloud Maker. Chuck Jones apparently learned to read when he was 3 because his father basically wanted his kids to be able to occupy themselves. And he was obsessed with Twain, and he was obsessed with the Coyote and Roughing It. And that's where the inspiration for Coyote came from. And he was, most of our heroes, we can't really identify with a lot of heroes because we're going to identify with the Coyote because he's such a loser. And, he shows us like how we're always like, failing, and how roadrunner who's always succeeding is doing it just kind of out of dumb luck. And he drew upon all these lessons from Twain and about the American West, which is why all those cartoons were set in the American West. And there are all these rules that he and Michael Maltese and Ted Pierce, the writers that helped him create that particular cartoon, were using, that really tapped into universals about creativity and about human nature. And I think that that's why a lot of these cartoons hold up so well, is because they were really thinking deeply about what they meant and what they wanted to do. And they were truly funny. And if you can attach that message onto something that's humorous, that keeps you laughing, I think it just keeps people coming back.
I think it helps it sink in too.
Mm-hmm.
Can you talk about the trial of Betty Boop?
Okay. Well, Betty wasn't put on trial herself because she was a cartoon character, but that's a great story, and that's a way I wanted to use to tell Betty Boop's story. Is so Disney had a huge success with Mickey Mouse, and the Fleischer brothers realized we need a new character. Their main character was a dog named Bimbo. And Bimbo back then actually wasn't a term used to refer to women. It was actually more often used to refer to people who like to fight a lot. And they saw that Mickey had a girlfriend, Minnie. So they said, well, let's give Bimbo a girlfriend. So the task fell to this artist named Grim Natwick, who had studied art in Europe. I think he alongside people like Egon Schiele and all these, artists that you associate more with museums. And he starts creating this character. And at first she was kind of a dog. She had these ears, like those hoop earrings that started as ears. She had these jowls. It was kind of a hybrid creature of a dog woman, which is, quite frankly, it looks rather bizarre. That's how she appears in the first several kind of iterations of her. And then they eventually realized, let's just make her a full-on woman. And Grim Natwick had a reputation from the art world as being able to draw the female form pretty well. And so they created what we today know as Betty. And in those very early Betty cartoons, they were very racy. Sometimes you get little glimpses of even nudity. It's all before the Hays Code. In 1934, the Hays Code put a lot of restrictions, a lot of self-imposed restrictions on what the movie studios would show. And there were some singers. There's a singer named Helen Kane, and that was basically her act, the boop boop a doop act. And she looked like Betty Boop. She had the spit curls, the whole thing. And her career, she was a Paramount player. The Fleischers, that's who their deal was with, Paramount. She sued. Her career had hit a rough patch. She looked a lot like Betty. Fleischer had apparently seen her perform. And there was this court scene. It went for days. There was a Tammany Hall judge, Myron Goldrick, who presided over it. And you have these two sides, discussing whether or not Max Fleischer had stolen Betty Boop's character from this singer, Helen Kane. And you've got these lawyers, and they're doing all this stuff like, they're repeating, boop boop a doop in the court, and they're singing it, and it's this big debate. If you look at the old newspaper accounts, because it was a big newspaper story, they're calling it boop boop a doopery, or the boops heard around the world, all this sort of thing. And eventually they determined that saying boop boop a doop was just gibberish. And they're like, Shakespeare did it with hey nani nani, that sort of thing, and that Fleischer hadn't stolen the idea from Helen Kane. And also later, they found out that there was an African-American singer, Baby Esther, who had also used boop boop a doop, and had probably used boop boop a doop before Helen Kane. But they determined that boop boop a doop is a broad enough thing that it wasn't theft. And Fleischer was kind of cleared of all those accusations. Although when you look at them side by side, they look very, very similar.
Very good. We're pretty much up to time. There is one other question here in the chat, though, from Louisa again. It's like, I now listen to these cartoons while I'm driving as kids watch the videos in the back seat. And I'm always so impressed by the use of language and music, like you mentioned. Do people track how much our language has been influenced by these cartoons, like the use of maroon for moron?
That's a really good question. I haven't really seen anything. On that. I think it's interesting too to look at the old accents. that you see in these cartoons, really reflecting the flavor of their times. Voice artist Mel Blanc, who did almost all the Looney Tunes characters, Bugs Bunny, Daffy Duck, all of them, was very studied in accents. Surgeons had looked at him and they said, you have the same musculature in your vocal cords as Caruso. I don't know how they knew that, but that's something he always liked to claim. And he would practice these different accents while driving around Hollywood in his Rolls Royce. That's the only place he would rehearse or practice, was while driving, in his car. So I don't know about that question specifically about the words, but I think another thing that's interesting to see from these is those old accents.
Well, thank you, everybody. This has been really wonderful, really, really fun and wonderful. So thank you, Reid and Malcolm and Amy and George, all of you from Grove Atlantic, for coming to us today and talking about your great books.